When Peter DeMarco lost his wife Laura to an asthma attack, his grief was overwhelming. All the days spent in the hospital with Laura, hooked up to machines, only to finally experience the nightmare he hoped would never come true, was a huge blow. Man praises hospital's aid, then learns the tragic truth of his wife's death. Still, Peter thanked the hospital for their tenderness and care during the roughest time of his family's life. But within a few months, a large picture of Laura's final moments came to light, and it showed that the hospital had a much bigger role in what should have been a preventable tragedy. It all started one day when Laura was alone in her apartment, having been taking some time off from work, and around 4 a.m. woke up and realized that she was having an asthma attack. However, as an asthmatic, a passionate weightlifter, and a hiker who worked out 6 days a week, she was cautious when treating her symptoms and knew exactly what she needed to do. As her apartment was conveniently located right near Somerville Hospital, Laura decided to walk there. She knew about the severity of her attack, but probably thought she'd get the usual nebulizer treatment and a dose of prednisone and feel good as new. It had happened before, so what could go wrong now? Unfortunately, a lot went wrong. Somewhere during her attempt to reach help, Laura's asthma attack crossed over from a minor issue to a life-threatening problem, and despite her proximity to help, it never arrived. Laura Beth Levis died at age 34, leaving behind her heartbroken husband, who never questioned what went on inside the hospital at the time, and only felt grateful for the fact that the staff had likely tried their absolute best. In fact, he was so touched by the treatment he and his wife had received in her final days that he wrote a thank you letter to them, singing praises for their efforts, which was even published in the New York Times. But his gratitude soon turned to horror when he found out that everything he believed had been a lie. 5 weeks after Laura's death, the circumstances still didn't sit right with her uncle, Robert Levis. He knew that Laura was a responsible young woman who had been living with asthma her whole life. Why would she suddenly fail to get the appropriate treatment now? He called the Somerville police, and though they don't normally make reports regarding medical calls, they felt compelled to help. They interviewed the first responders, gathered evidence, and soon strung together a report which would reveal the tragic truth to the world. Initially, the hospital staff had told Peter that Laura was found some distance away from the hospital, which was the reason she wasn't found in time to be saved. But the report showed that the staff had lied. Laura had indeed made it to the hospital. In fact, she had made it all the way to the entrance door, but it was locked and the security on the other side was empty. The grim revelations didn't end there, as Peter wrote dozens of letters and made many phone calls to obtain the hospital's surveillance footage. When he finally got his hands on the tape, he found out that Laura had reached the locked ambulance entrance to the ER, saw no one, and could only make it to the bench about 30 feet away from the public ER entrance from where she called 911. Laura managed to tell the 911 dispatcher where she was and the seriousness of her situation between her labored breaths. It took some time, but the dispatcher was finally able to contact a nurse at the ER to go check outside. From the surveillance footage, the nurse stayed by the door, shifting her head around, and failed to notice Laura collapsed on the bench. The nurse never alerted the security guards about the matter, didn't walk outside to see if anyone needed help, and instead told the 911 dispatcher that there was no one there. By then, Laura couldn't respond to the dispatcher anymore, and had passed out from the attack. So they tracked the location of her cell phone and made another devastating mistake. In an unforeseen technical error, Laura's cell phone pinged a tower about 200 feet away from the hospital when she was actually so much closer. The Somerville Fire Department spent critical time searching the wrong area, though they eventually spotted Laura near the ER entrance and began emergency CPR. Sadly, they were too late. A police officer on the scene noted an unprofessional lack of response from the hospital staff when he tried to alert someone inside the ER to the situation. I started to bang on the glass with my ring, and from in the back I heard someone yell, "Relax," in a very annoyed tone. And then, as she turned the corner and saw me, she said, "Take it easy," in the same annoyed tone. The bitter truth was laid out before them, and the only conclusion Peter and his family could draw was that several people had failed Laura in her time of need, and it resulted in her death. Peter immediately went to Lupin and Meyer, a prominent medical malpractice firm. He didn't want to take revenge, but rather knew that a successful settlement would hold the hospital responsible, which would prevent further tragedies. It looked like the government was on Peter's side at first. The Massachusetts Department of Public Health found violations, and so did the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, charging the Somerville Hospital with $90,000 in fines. But there was only so much they could do, since the Massachusetts law protected hospital staff and prevented fines over $100,000 in wrongful death suits. Peter felt hopeless. With a lawsuit off the table, what could he do to save even just one life? How could he prevent an unnecessary death like Laura's? How do you change the system? Peter was determined not to give up. He would fight for Laura and the thousands of people who died due to similar circumstances every year. Turning to legislation, he drafted Laura's Law, which would ensure closer inspections and monitoring of hospital entrances, as well as proper signage and lighting. If it passed, it would be the first of its kind, and by the closing days of the legislative session in early January of 2021, it looked like it had a 50-50 chance of pulling through. The state representatives and bill sponsors let Peter know that if they wanted to win, they were going to need to make a lot more noise. So that's what they did. Family and friends turned to everyone and anyone they could to flood the state house with phone calls and emails, asking their representatives to vote in support. And finally, after all the struggle, their efforts were rewarded, and on January 5th, Laura's Law passed. Peter and his in-laws attended the social distanced ceremony where Massachusetts Governor Baker signed Laura's Law. It was a bittersweet victory, but Peter knew that Laura would be happy to know that her death wasn't in vain, and that others wouldn't have to suffer the same tragic fate. The family learned a harrowing lesson about the medical system and how your trust shouldn't always lie in the professionals, especially not ones who prioritized their interests to a criminal degree. Their conscience not letting them spill the truth even after Peter's published letter of thanks in the New York Times.